People always say money changes people, but I learned the hard way that money doesn't change anyone at all. It simply unmasks them. I grew up in my grandparents' home, a modest place with faded curtains and furniture older than I was. To me, it never felt small. It felt safe. My parents' marriage fell apart when I was young, and while they struggled to rebuild their lives, my grandparents quietly stepped in without complaint or conditions. They became my constant, my morning tea, my bedtime stories, my audience at every school performance, no matter how small or embarrassing. They weren't rich, but they were generous in the ways that mattered. My grandmother saved every handwritten note I ever gave her. My grandfather fixed broken things with patience, even when they couldn't truly be fixed. When I got older, the roles reversed. I drove them to doctor appointments, cooked their meals, and sat beside hospital beds at night, listening to machines hum. I never thought of it as sacrifice. It was love, plain and simple. The rest of the family existed at a distance. Holidays came and went with polite excuses. Phone calls were rare. When my grandparents' health declined, visits became even rarer. Still, no one ever forgot to ask how things were going, just never stayed long enough to find out. When my grandparents passed away within months of each other, grief settled into my bones. At the funeral, relatives appeared like shadows from another life. They cried loudly, embraced me tightly, and spoke about how close we all were. I noticed how quickly conversations shifted, from memories to assets, from loss to logistics. I didn't think much of it until the lawyer gathered us together. I sat quietly, exhausted, barely listening, until I heard my name, once, then again. Everything had been left to me. The house, the savings, the investments, nearly $900,000. The room froze, then the smiles came. My aunt clasped my hands and said my grandparents must have trusted me deeply. My uncle nodded approvingly, already talking about helping me manage it responsibly. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly leaned closer, laughing, reminiscing, calling me family. I smiled back, numb and overwhelmed. Inside, something whispered that this wasn't about love anymore, and that whisper would soon prove to be right. At first, everything felt gentle, almost caring. The days after the will were filled with phone calls and messages I had never received before. Relatives checked in just to see how I was holding up. They asked if I was eating properly, sleeping well, taking care of myself. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe grief had brought us closer. Then the questions changed. My aunt suggested we meet for coffee to talk about the future. My uncle invited me to dinner, something he had never done before. Conversations slowly drifted away from memories of my grandparents and toward responsibility, fairness, and family duty. They spoke softly, carefully, like people testing thin ice. "You're still young." My aunt said one afternoon, stirring her tea, "That's a lot of money to handle alone." Another relative nodded. "Your grandparents probably assumed we'd help guide you." I didn't argue. I listened. I tried to stay polite. Soon, the concern became expectation. My cousin called late one night, crying about debts and bad decisions. She didn't directly ask for money, but she didn't have to. Another cousin sent links to expensive apartments, joking about how life would be easier with family support. My uncle talked about a business opportunity that just needed a little push. When I hesitated, the warmth cooled. The same people who once praised my grandparents' trust in me began questioning it. They wondered out loud if grief had clouded my grandparents' judgment. Someone suggested they were pressured. Another hinted the lawyer had influenced them. Each comment cut deeper than the last. The worst moment came during a family gathering. My aunt, frustrated by my silence, finally snapped. She said it wasn't right that one person held everything while others struggled. She reminded me that blood came before paperwork. Then she said something I will never forget. They were old and vulnerable. You should have protected them better. I felt the air leave my lungs. These were the people who didn't visit hospitals, who didn't answer calls, who didn't sit through sleepless nights or whispered goodbyes. Yet now, they stood as judges, rewriting history to suit their needs. The message became clear: share the money, or lose the family. I went home that night and sat alone in my grandparents' empty living room. The silence felt heavy, but it was honest. I held onto my grandmother's shawl and remembered her gentle voice telling me that love should never come with demands. That night, I understood something painful but necessary. Their kindness had conditions. My grandparents' love never did, and I knew exactly which one I was going to honor. I didn't confront anyone after that night. I didn't send long messages or demand apologies. I didn't try to defend myself against accusations that twisted the truth. I learned quickly that explaining yourself to people who feel entitled only gives them more words to use against you. Instead, I became quiet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still answered calls politely. I still attended a few family gatherings. I nodded when they talked about plans that never included my consent. They assumed my silence meant uncertainty. They thought I was overwhelmed, confused, and eventually persuadable. They were wrong. Behind the scenes, I moved carefully. I met with professionals my grandparents had trusted. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. Every signature I placed felt heavy, but also strangely grounding, like I was building something solid beneath my feet. The inheritance was transferred into a protected trust and long-term investments. Not impulsively, not dramatically, just securely, legally sealed, untouchable by anyone except me, no shared access, no emotional leverage, no last-minute guilt trips disguised as emergencies. I didn't announce it. I also did something else quietly, almost reverently. I set aside a portion of the money for the things my grandparents believed in: education for children who didn't have support, care for the elderly who sat alone in hospital rooms, community kitchens that fed people without asking who they were or what they had done wrong. I made the donations anonymously, no plaques, no gratitude, no family applause, just intention. When my relatives eventually found out about the trust, the reaction was explosive. Phones rang nonstop. Messages poured in angry, panicked, accusatory. They said I had betrayed the family, that I had been calculating all along, that I was punishing them. But what struck me most was how quickly the concern for me vanished. No one asked if I was okay anymore. No one asked how I was coping with grief. They only asked what they had lost. That's when the truth settled fully in my chest. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted access. As the noise faded, something unexpected took its place: peace. For the first time since my grandparents passed, my days were quiet again. No tension, no performance, no fear of disappointing people who only loved me conditionally. I began building a life with patience, stability, and intention, values my grandparents had lived by every day. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't seek revenge. I simply closed the door, and sometimes that is the loudest statement of all. Time has a way of doing what arguments never can. It reveals truth without raising its voice. Years passed after I moved the inheritance, and with them, the noise faded completely. The family group chats died. Invitations stopped. Birthdays went unacknowledged again, just like before the money existed. At first, the silence hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. Losing people, even the wrong people, still feels like loss. But slowly, the quiet became comfortable. I built a life my grandparents would have recognized and smiled at. I finished my education without debt hanging over my head. I chose a home that felt peaceful rather than impressive. I woke up without anxiety, without waiting for messages that only came with demands attached. The money didn't make me extravagant, it made me secure. One afternoon, years later, I ran into my aunt at a grocery store. She stood in the cereal aisle, studying prices with a tired expression I had never seen before. Time had softened her sharpness, but it hadn't erased the bitterness in her eyes when she recognized me. She asked how I was doing. The question surprised me. It felt genuine, but late like a letter sent after the address had changed. "I'm doing well," I said, and I was. I didn't explain my investments or the trust. I didn't talk about success or stability. I didn't remind her of the accusations or the ultimatums. I didn't need to. She nodded slowly, as if measuring something she couldn't quite name. Then she wished me well and walked away. That was it. No apology, no closure, no dramatic ending, just a quiet understanding. I realized then that revenge didn't arrive with fireworks or public victories. It arrived in the form of peace, in being unbothered, in living honestly while others carried resentment that had nowhere to land. My grandparents taught me that love is shown through consistency, not entitlement. Through care, not control. Protecting what they left me wasn't selfish, it was respect. The inheritance gave me choices, but the real gift was clarity. I learned who loved me when there was nothing to gain. I learned that walking away can be an act of self-respect, and I learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to refuse to be manipulated. I didn't win by taking anything from them. I won by keeping my life intact, and somewhere deep in my heart, I know my grandparents would have called that more than enough.